back to the podcast. Today I have Paul Attaway, a novelist who is writing a series of novels. And it was a really interesting episode to get into and talk to Paul, because to build a world around a book, we talk about how it's such a visual component to writing a novel, in the fiction space, and how it differs in writing in a nonfiction space. And it's interesting because Paul is writing books in a series, and how he talks about how it all started, where it's going, and how he builds character and arc and the story, and the whole process. And I'm fascinated by this because we've had a lot of people on, a lot of great authors so far. I believe this is the first author that's writing a novel. So really dive in here and enjoy this. If you're a future novelist, if you love novels, here's a backstage pass to the process. And you get to meet Paul Attaway today here on the Living the Next Chapter, a podcast for you. Today is where your book begins. Here we go. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Living the Next Chapter. I have an author with me today, an author in a genre, in a style, writing style that we haven't talked to yet. And I'm excited about this, to be able to talk to a fiction writer with a series of books. This must take a lot of planning and a lot of thought to be able to think this far in advance, to write many books around a theme. I'm very excited and curious to speak today, Paul Attaway, paulattaway.com. And he has two books to share with us today. Maybe a little sneak peek into book number 3 that's in the works. But Paul, it's so nice to have you with us today. Thank you for joining Living the Next Chapter.
Oh, it's great. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
It's exciting. So, Paul, let everybody know where you are in the world, and maybe a little bit of your backstory before you went down the path of becoming an author.
Sure. Well, right now I'm living in Charleston, South Carolina. My wife and I, we raised 3 children in Phoenix, Arizona. They're all adults now. One of our daughters attended college at Charleston, and we discovered the city visiting her. And back in 2014, when she graduated, we bought a small house here, and we began to kind of commute a little bit. We'd spend, a month or 2 in Phoenix, and then 2-3 weeks here and then back. We were testing it out, and after about 5 years, we realized we just loved it here. So about a year and a half ago, we sold our house in Phoenix, and we have moved here permanently. So I'm now living in Charleston.
Beautiful.
Which is where my 2 books take place. So I'm 59, and I began this writing project back about 4 to 5 years ago. So leading up to that, I had a full career as a small businessman. College, finance major. Then I went to law school, and I was a lawyer for 2 years. And that just didn't take. I loved law school. I loved the whole process, but the actual practice of law, it's tough, and it wasn't for me. So from there, I moved into the business world and worked for a family business, my father's business, manufacturing building materials, and then went out on my own and started 3 different companies, everything from manufacturing to work in the semiconductor and life sciences industry, real estate lending. And again, I joke that the word entrepreneur is Latin for nobody will hire me. So, I started a few businesses and then was a bit burned out by around 2014, 2015. And I had a very, very good separation from my partner. He bought me out, or we separated, and everything went great. But I was too tired to start any new businesses, so I became a consultant, an executive for hire, and did that for a few years. And I met some really fascinating people, and there were parts of it that I enjoyed, but going forward long term, I just couldn't see spending the next 15 to 20 years doing that. And I was too young to retire. So I got it in my head that I could write a book, because I'd finish a book, and sometimes I'd go, that book was just fantastic. Or other times I'd finish a book and I'd go, I could have done that. cocky, you're talking around your wife, you say things that you probably really wouldn't say to anybody else. And so my wife got a little tired of hearing me say that. And she says, well, you either just do it or move on. So I said, fine, I'll do it. So I sat down I sat out to write a book. And I joke now that I have a tremendous amount of respect for people that write books that I used to deem as not very good. As with so many other things, it was significantly harder than I anticipated when I set out to do it. So, but I absolutely love the process.
So that's interesting. So did you come to a point in the road, Paul, at the beginning where you had to decide whether you're going to take the nonfiction path or the fiction path? Like, was that a conscious decision you made, or was it naturally where you were headed?
No, I never really wrestled with that. I don't consider myself an expert in anything to hold myself out so that I could write a nonfiction. And there wasn't anything that I wanted to become an expert in. So, I mean, it would have been dreary for me to try to take a subject, become an expert in it so I could write a book about it. And I didn't have a business career to further. And a lot of folks that write nonfiction, they do it in conjunction with their business. And it's a great idea. And one hand furthers the other and vice versa. But that wasn't me. So it was a fairly easy decision. Fiction was where I wanted to be. And frankly, it's a lot of fun because you can just, make stuff up. So that wasn't deciding to write fiction. That was the easy part.
So I look at a fiction book, and I'm very curious as a reader as to how you map out, build character, create arc, craft a story with an end in mind. Like, you almost have to see the entire painting before you start to write, where maybe in a nonfiction, you can kind of just do the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, and then you get to the end and you're like, oh, I guess I'm done. So yeah. It seems very different, like a different muscle altogether.
It is. And, I've now written 2 books. I've started my 3rd book, and I have ideas for like another 3 books that I've written, all the paragraph about, and so but there are people that have written, dozens and dozens of books. And I would imagine you would get a different answer from someone who's had a career of doing this than from me, who's still, I'd say, a newbie at it. But I don't have a roadmap. I have themes that I think I want to write about. And so I'm now into my 3rd book, and it is a series. So I've got some recurring characters. So the character development, it's not done, but I have a couple of characters, and there'll be some new characters in book 3. But I do have, I've written my opening scene, and I have a pretty good idea of what the last scene is going to be. And I have an idea for what the character arc for the protagonist is going to be, but I don't have it completely worked out. And so I have to get this person from here to here. So I do start out, I do have some 30,000 foot view, as to as to big concepts and big ideas and themes. And in both my books, a recurring theme would be freedom. And the things that bind us, it's not just, chains, being in jail, being held down, but the things that bind us are our fears, expectations, addictions, running from the law, whether you're rightfully accused or wrongfully accused. So, any number of things can make it difficult for us to live out our lives to the fullest. And so, in my characters, they all have some sort of personal flaw, and it's that flaw that creates the sand in the wheel that you have to work out, and that creates our character arc. So I do focus on character quite a bit, and I think that's personally, I enjoy books that have well-developed characters and interesting characters. Now, but you need a plot to propel that story to fuel the character arc. You need bad stuff to happen to them. So like when I was writing my first book, I had ideas of relationships between father and son. And I had a wonderful relationship with my father, and I felt that I could write that because I'm both a father and a son. So I'm writing this, and at some point I realized this is boring. This is boring. So I go, I need to kill somebody. So I threw a murder in, and so my books, people ask me what the genre is, and I go, okay, it's either suspense thriller or it's a family drama. And so there is drama. You do have to, turn these people's lives upside down. But then the important thing is to make sure that the character reacts to the events in their life in character. Because if they're not acting the way you would expect them to act, then something's missing. It's just not adding up. So if the characters act or don't act in character or how you would expect it, I think the story will fall flat. But if they act in accordance with how you expect, then that makes the story interesting and it makes it more realistic. And then, of course, you hope that the characters either change or maybe they don't change. Maybe that's what happens. Their stubbornness keeps them from ever fully evolving. But so I focus more on the characters, and then I want the plot twists and turns to keep the reader interested and to keep them turning the pages. And so that it's suspenseful and it's thrilling, but the plot needs to further the character's arc, the character's change, so that when the story ends, I like to have uplifting endings. I'm not into the downer story. I mean, there's people who write that, and that's great. I like my stories to kind of have an upbeat ending. So
it's interesting. So are you, as you're writing, as you're sitting down at your computer or a piece of paper and a pen, and you're crafting this story with those guardrails that you set up, like you mentioned in the beginning, you kind of know a beginning, you kind of know an end. But as you're doing this, are you visually in your mind watching this play out? I'd love to kind of get an inside look to how you creatively build this world that you're building.
So, I'm very visual. Okay. And in terms of a writing style, I don't write what one would call literary literature. I'm more of in the business, I would be a genre writer. I'm a storyteller.
Okay.
Now, I take a lot of pride in writing a good sentence, but I try to write very descriptive sentences, not full of metaphors. I mean, some metaphors are great, but if you have too many after a while, you kind of go, okay, what's going on here? So if I'm going to write a scene, I have to be able to see it. And so I will very visually describe, the mother standing, putting her knitting needles down, standing from the sofa, walking over. Her left foot is on the first stair and she turns. And so I try to write it so that you can see what's happening. And so it's descriptive, but it's descriptive in terms of action and describing the scene so that the reader can, hopefully feel that they're there in the place that it's happening. And then I don't create worlds. My stories take place in Charleston, South Carolina, back in the 70s. So I don't have to, if anything, I try to do the best job I can of recreating what was here in the 70s in terms of landmarks and things like that.
So a little bit of historical reference as well, and maybe some research on your part to make sure you're talking about places and things that people might remember. Okay.
Correct. Yeah. Or, if I'm going to cite a restaurant, I'm going to make sure the restaurant actually was in business in 1975. So the book that I just finished, it has a few characters in it, and both of them are inspired by real life people. And so in the afterword, I explained to the reader who these characters were inspired by. So I researched the characters and I pulled bits and pieces from their lives. So that I didn't tell the reader, like in my book that I just finished called Eli's Redemption, I have a one-legged Scottish golfer. that sounds ridiculous. How can you play golf on one leg? Well, a man named Ernest Jones was one of the most successful golf teachers of the 20th century. He lost his right leg below his knee in World War I, still managed to play par golf. And he was a phenomenal teacher. So I reference him because people might go, well, that was stupid, a one-legged golfer. And then they go, based on a real life person. Now all of a sudden that's a bit more interesting. So there is, I do enjoy the research.
I love the detail. I love the, that you can do that and bring that detail to it. And there's some authenticity with that as well, right? You're not just making things up. So the one thing too is you always kind of hear for a fiction writer how sometimes these fiction stories become great screenplays and televisions and movies and then you also hear people say, well, the book is much different than what I saw on screen. The creative license that happens between there. Do you approach writing a novel or a fictional piece as this could become something someday, or are you satisfied with the cover to cover? This is a complete project.
Well, okay. I'd answered that question. I believe the books are a complete project.
Okay.
But they are a series. And I'd love it if they were turned into a series on a Netflix or Apple or any of these streaming platforms. And it is a project to approach that and to try to figure out, well, now what do I do? How do I put myself in front of these people? How do I turn this into a screenplay? So yeah, I think the characters and the location would lend themselves to streaming content, and that they could be broken down into vignettes or shorter stories. And so I read a lot, but product of the TV age, I watched a lot of TV in my time, watched a lot of movies. So my understanding of stories comes not just from reading stories, but also from seeing them played out on the screen. And so some might say that if you're reading my books, they might almost seem like a movie, because I have a lot of my scenes are short, my chapters are short, and because there's a lot of action, and you want to see what happens next. So my chapters aren't 30, 40 pages long. There's a lot of action, and there's a lot of different characters and subplots going on. So I'd love to see it on the screen.
It seems to be that, like, even as you described the woman standing up, putting her knitting needles down, walking to the stairs, there's a visual component that as I'm reading it, I'm picturing it. So maybe that's why it seems to tend to lend itself to becoming a visual piece in the future, because it's already kind of mapped out as a reader.
Yeah. That and I do try to I do spend time trying to set the location. Charleston is a beautiful city, and there is tremendous history here. The city goes back to 1663 when it was founded, and so you can write about this city. And there are a lot of people who come to the city who live here, of course, obviously, but a lot of people who travel here and visit it, and so it's a popular destination to write about. Similarly, though, in my second book, part of the story takes place in the Bahamas. Well, there's a connection between the Bahamas and Charleston, because during the Revolutionary War, when the Brits lost, they didn't feel very welcome. Many of the Brits who lived here, they were referred to as loyalists. So when the war was over, they didn't go back to England. The King George gave them land in the Bahamas because they had been loyal throughout the war. So there's a lot of, there were some 5,000 British loyalists who left the colonies and went to the Bahamas. And so there's a lot that you can write about there. So setting the scene and describing what life in the Bahamas was like in the 70s, was also part of the task.
That's interesting, because from my perspective as a reader, I love history. So if an author can take me down a path and throw and put in historical references and and tie that into the story. That's a great blend between a fictional world and the real world. That's a
Right.
nice
It is.
bridge.
It's not quite historical fiction. First of all, it's just not that old. I think we think of historical fiction more, 17th, 18th, 17th, 16th century stories. This story is, I was alive then, so I like to think it's not quite historical fiction, but it is. There is, as I'm getting older as well, I understand the attraction of nostalgia. You're nostalgic for what we all term as a simpler time. And so I do have references, cultural references, sports references, historical references. In my first book, there's a scene where one of the characters has finished playing golf that day, and he's one of the bad guys, and he's wrestling, but he's also watching the Masters. And it was the year when I forget who it was, but Jack Nicklaus came in second in the Masters that year. And so I put in there, people were saying Jack would never win again. But you can laugh because he did. In 1986, he won it again. So I had these references to baseball World Series games in 1975, Oakland A's, Cincinnati Reds, the Hares against the Squares, And so it's fun to go back and put in these actual real historical events into the lives of people that you have made up. I think it adds a bit of reality to the story.
So I think I saw a little glimpse of the books in your hand there. Did you want to show? Let's show these, and let's maybe talk a little bit about what's, which one's first? Is it Eli?
Yeah, so this is the first book.
Blood
it's
one?
called,
Okay.
Blood in the Low Country.
Okay.
And the Low Country is a reference to the area in which I live, the area, the coastline from Georgia up through South Carolina is referred to as the Low Country. And blood refers to both family, but also blood. We have a murder. So in this story, we have a family that we meet. It's called the Atkins family. And Monty Atkins is the protagonist. He's the father. Yes, his wife, Rose, are raising two boys, Walker and Eli. And there's a murder that takes place in our community. It's Eli's girlfriend. And we have the hunt for the real killer. Eli is falsely accused, and he has to flee the scene. So this book is about what Monty has to do to keep his family together, to save his marriage, to save his business, to save his life, and to try to catch the bad guy. And so that was book one. That came out in September 2020. And then book two is Eli's redemption. And Eli is the son that had to flee, and he fled to the Bahamas. And so people wanted to know, well, what happened to Eli? Well, this is what happened to Eli. And so this story kind of picks up where this story ends, but it goes back in time. We find out what Eli was doing while this story was taking place. And then the stories weave together a little bit. And we learn about what Eli's been up to. That he has to come back to Charleston because he was living under a false identity because he had to hide from these charges, and what he has to do to regain his name and his identity so that he can live his life freely. So this is book number two.
I like how you have him in the Bahamas. Back to your comment about the Loyalists going to the Bahamas.
Yeah,
I'm like, that's clever. I like that.
So and so book three will be Eli's younger brother is named Walker. And book three is going to be about Walker. And so Walker is born in 1961. So he'll be graduating from college in the 80s. And he will, right now, I have him ending up working in Europe after the fall of the wall in East Berlin. And as the Soviet Union is collapsing, and the oligarchs are appearing on the scene in Russia. So I'm thinking he's going to be working in Russia, in the business capacity. So I'm still working out the story, but it'll involve the rest of the family and some of the other characters that I've developed, both good guys and bad guys, will make appearances, I believe.
Paul, I really love the creativeness of listening to you and how you're formulating all this. I think of a person with all those spinning plates on a pole,
Yeah.
and they're spinning, and you have so many plates as you sit down to build this world. You have to remember that in book 1, we went
Yeah.
left instead of right. Book 2, we make reference to the left instead of the right. Book 3, what would have happened if he went right? Like, there's so many, and you have to spin all these plates at the same time and
There
make
is a
all
bit of
this.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, when I sat down to write the first book, I didn't have a series in mind. But as I got further along into it, I started thinking, I can do this. I can do this. And so I began to plant a few things in the first book that would be jumping off points for book 2. And book 2 wrapped up a lot, answered a lot of questions. So book 3 is going to be really a new story, some similar characters, but it's going to be a new story. And both Walker and Eli are affected by dysfunction that's in their family. And my wife and I like to say every family is dysfunctional. Some of them are just lowercase d, and some of them are uppercase d. So their family was uppercase d dysfunctional, and it spilled over into Eli's life, and he had to deal with it. Well, Walker was not unaffected. Walker will be carrying forth baggage, and we'll see this personal baggage played out against a backdrop of historical events. So again, so I am creating a lot, but I don't have to create the history. The backdrop is there. The story, the wall fell in 1989. So I could pick a decade, and then I look to see what was happening in that decade.
Yeah.
And then I put them into that story, and then I craft I put them into that setting and that history, and then I try to craft a story about their lives with that as the backdrop.
It's very creative, Paul. I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I'm looking forward to actually being able to get the copies. And I know my wife and I love to find a new adventure to get into, and I'm pretty sure we're going to eat these up pretty quickly. Any tips on? We're going to be ending up soon here. Any tips on self-publishing, or just a thought for anybody who's thinking about writing in the fiction area?
Two things. First of all, with respect to writing, the best advice that I got was, okay, so we take a book, we read a book beginning to end, but that's not how they're written. At least that's not how I've written my 2. When I sat down to write my first book, I had all these, I had ideas. I had stack of legal pads just full of notes and ideas. And I sit down literally to write, and all of a sudden I'm stumped. I had no idea how to get started, no idea how to actually do this. Well, as it happens, my wife and I had been recently introduced to a new couple. We were new to Charleston, looking to meet people. And so we met this couple. They were a few years older than us, which is only important because they had fully retired. And so the gentleman is saying, Paul, are you still working? Tell me about yourself. What do you do? So I gave him my little synopsis, and I said, I'm trying to write a book. And as it turns out, he'd retired from a 40-year career as a film editor in Hollywood. So he knew a lot about storytelling. And I shared with him my frustration, and he just said, quit trying to write a book. You'll never do it. Just start writing. Write a scene. Write anything. It doesn't matter what you write. Just start writing, and it'll come to you. And he was right. And so when I get stuck, I just start writing. And it doesn't even, like the first few sentences could be, I'm sitting at my typewriter trying to figure out what's going to happen next. Oh, wait a minute, maybe and the ideas just start coming. And so I write a lot of scenes. And so when I go to edit the book, a fair amount of the time is spent moving scenes around or connecting scenes. We're going, okay, this is good, but I got to get them from here to there. I got to fill it in. And so it's, for me, it's building blocks. I'm writing a story, and it's got to make sense in the plot. What do the readers know that the characters don't know? What do the characters know that the readers don't know? And so for me, it's a lot of building blocks. And so I write it, and then a lot of it kind of gets pieced together. So to anyone out there who was struggling, the advice that I received was, quit trying to write a book, page 1 to the very last page. Just start writing, and it'll come to you. It's in terms of self-publishing advice, we don't have enough time. So I would encourage anyone, and I mean this, if you're listening, you go to my website, paulattaway.com, go to the contact page. There's a little message box. And if you want to talk to me about the things that I did right, the things that I did wrong, the things that I've learned, I'd be more than happy to share it with anybody.
That's a great resource, Paul. I really appreciate you offering that. That's wonderful. Yeah, because I wanted to give it value, but at the same time, we have so much to talk about with the book and the writings, and maybe we could have like a 2-3 hour podcast here. And I'm sure you have other things on your day besides that. So I appreciate your time.
Sure.
So as far as connecting with you, your website is the best way to reach you, paulattaway.com.
Correct. If you go there and you fill out the contact page, it'll reach me. My email address is simply paul@paulattaway.com.
Okay.
And that's Attaway is ATTAWAY.
And the books are available through your website?
They're available through the website. They're available, through Amazon. I don't have any bookstores in Canada where they're being carried, but there are a dozen or so bookstores in the Southeast United States that carry the book, and hopefully more.
Excellent. It's really nice to meet you, Paul. Thank you so much for taking time for us, for our audience. Again, this is the first edition of having someone come in your area of expertise, and whether you have one book or many, you come with so much knowledge and insight. I really do appreciate the fact that you have time for us today.
Oh, my pleasure. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
That's great. So everyone go check out paulattaway.com and some great books that you need to add to your library and add to your life. Thank you, Paul, so much.
Thank you.
All right.